Hello folks, I hope it's all going groovy for you. Welcome to this Musical Steps first episode where, while stepping around and considering the musical significance of the area, I'll raise a philosophical point about fate. So let's step on whilst I explain where I am. This is Vale Road. This seemingly ordinary road in the relatively affluent South Liverpool suburb of Woolton is extremely important in the story of the Beatles because a young schoolboy called Charles Ivan Vaughan lived here in the 1950s. Who, you might ask? Well, Ivan, as he was known, rather than by his first name Charles, had the most significant part in bringing together John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and a little later, by association, George Harrison. Now, there is a lot of information and sites I want to cover about this area, so I'll split the subject into 2 or 3 episodes, so that they're more manageable for you to watch in one sitting. Anyway, in case you're watching the resulting mini-series out of sequence, this is episode 1 of the 2 or 3 proposed movies. So here's my starting point on Vale Road. Now, you'll no doubt know the name Vale derives from the word valley. And that's appropriate here because the area around Vale Road is effectively a valley between the now closed nearby quarries that covered much of the area. Though in the 1950s, when John Lennon and Ivan Vaughan were schoolboys here, it was still very much a working quarry area. For this opening Musical Steps episode, I'll partially follow the northwest route along Vale Road in the direction of where it connects with the road where John Lennon's childhood house is located on Menlove Avenue, around half a mile from here. John lived there with his Aunt Mimi from the age of 5. I'll talk more about John's Aunt Mimi and his mother Julia as we progress. It's enough to know at the moment Julia was Mimi's sister, and they didn't always get on too well because of Julia's lifestyle, a lifestyle frowned upon in post-war Britain. Despite living with Aunt Mimi from the age of 5, John did frequently return to his mother Julia's house at 1 Blomfield Road, just over a mile or so away from here. He went over there to stay most weekends as he grew older, through his teens. That is, he did until tragedy struck, when his mother Julia was killed in a road accident just outside Mimi's house on Menlove Avenue, as she was leaving to return home by bus from the stop across the road. John's half-sister, also called Julia, and younger than John by 6 years, later described the tragedy. She said about their mother's tragic death. She went one evening in 1958 to visit John at her sister Mimi's house. She left a few hours later to catch the bus home. As she was crossing the road, she was knocked down by a car. A very short distance away, Jackie and I were in bed, asleep. John, who had left Mimi's house ahead of our mother to come to our house, was downstairs talking to my father, waiting for Mummy to come home. That ordinary group of people, doing ordinary things, were unaware that Mummy had died. John was 17, I was 11, and Jackie was 8 years old. All 3 of us were devastated. As was frequently the case at weekends when he got older, John was staying over at Julia's house on Blomfield Road that Saturday evening. Whilst walking here on Vale Road today, I'll not go as far as where the accident occurred, where Vale Road connects to Menlove Avenue, until later. So, to help explain the geography, this Google Earth view indicates the layout of Vale Road and Menlove Avenue and various roads that junction off that lead up to St. Peter's Church by Woolton Village, where the birth of the Beatles started. As I said, the termination of Vale Road at the far end from here, where it connects to Menlove Avenue, is the location of the awful tragedy, his mother's death, that understandably severely affected the 17-year-old John Lennon for the rest of his life. As already mentioned, I'll talk more fully about Julia's life in another Musical Steps episode. Before I visit Mendips in this episode, the name given to Lennon's main childhood home on Menlove Avenue by the previous owners, I'll indicate the junction of Vale Road and Linkster Road because of its little known but huge relevance to the formation of the Beatles. More about that in a moment. As I step along Vale Road here and the roads branching off it, you'll no doubt notice a fair amount of sandstone walls and houses. Like many parts of Liverpool, Woolton had quarries that produced the desirable red sandstone used for all sorts of buildings, from cottages to palaces to churches, local and distant. Much of this area still shows evidence of the quarries that had been worked here for hundreds of years, and that, by association, gave its name to the local Quarrybank school that later gave Lennon's pre-Beatles skiffle group, the Quarrymen, their name. After I wander just over halfway along Vale Road, I'll then head up the steep incline of sandstone-lined Castle Street to a narrow path that John Lennon as a small child would likely have regularly used to get to Sunday school at St. Peter's Church, a location, as indicated, that has the most significant connection with the formation of the biggest band in the world. That said, it's likely John would sometimes have used Linkster Road to reach Church Road, where St. Peter's Church is situated, because it more directly, or at least more easily, connects Vale Road with Church Road. As we know from the Google Map scene, Vale Road here partially runs parallel to Menlove Avenue where, for some of the houses, back gardens butt up against each other. That seemingly innocuous connection of back gardens butting up to each other is an important point in the Beatles story. Now, to momentarily digress, Beatles fan Dave McCabe, the singer-songwriter from the Zootons, owns a house here on Vale Road, bought by the royalties from his song Valerie, famously covered by Amy Winehouse. Obviously I won't point out which particular house it is to protect his privacy, though everyone around here knows which house it is. It's at the far end of this long and winding Vale Road. Now, if you are a Beatles fan, you'll no doubt already know the importance of Menlove Avenue because of John's main childhood home being situated there. Though we might not know how important Vale Road is in terms of the Beatles story. To reiterate what I've spoken about so far, it's here on Vale Road that seemingly inconsequential events occurred that, without those events, it would have meant the Beatles didn't exist. Now, prior to explaining what I mean by all that, I'll raise that connected philosophical point I referred to earlier that has always interested me. I'm referring to the concept known as fate, the aligning of stars across the universe, or whatever you want to call it. Here's my example as a help. Fate in this example refers to a chain of events linked by one person, Ivan Vaughan, who connected together three of the greatest pop songwriters ever, Lennon, McCartney and Harrison. Let's imagine what would have happened without fate intervening. If the 5-year-old schoolboy Ivan Vaughan hadn't lived on this parallel running street to his early childhood best friend John, and who later became best friends with Paul because Ivan's parents didn't want him being at the same secondary school with John, it's likely you would never have heard of their surnames, Lennon and McCartney. So here's precisely why Ivan Vaughan, a relatively anonymous psychology lecturer in later life teaching at Homerton College in Cambridge, was so important to the world of pop music. Ivan Vaughan became one of Lennon's closest friends when John moved to Menlove Avenue to live with his Aunt Mimi because of the broken relationship between John's mother Julia and father Alf. It seems the final straw for Aunt Mimi was the 5-year-old John being taken away by his father to stay with him in Blackpool, ostensibly anyway, prior to him secretly planning on taking John to live with him on the other side of the world. It's often reported John was forced to choose between living with his mother Julia and his estranged father Alf when he was only 5 years old. Now I'll go into more detail about Julia's relationship with Alf and how it impacted on John at another time. For the moment, it's enough to indicate there are a fair amount of contradictory opinions concerning the reason Julia allowed her sister Mimi to take parental control of John rather than her. Most people agree today Mimi reported her sister Julia to social services for various reasons we'll look at in a separate episode. As a consequence of Julia's lifestyle, it was agreed Mimi became the guardian of infant John and living at Menlove Avenue, the main road that runs parallel to this suburban street, Vale Road. Let's progress here with Ivan Vaughan's importance in the Beatles story. Despite being a little younger than him, Ivan got to know John very well because when John moved into his Aunt Mimi's in 1946, the first friend he made was Ivan Vaughan. Incidentally, that characteristic John possessed of being unconcerned with age differences, if he recognised intelligence in someone, also played a part in how he easily accepted McCartney, despite Paul being around 18 months John's junior at school. As mentioned a moment ago, young Ivan Vaughan lived here on Vale Road, just behind and running parallel to Aunt Mimi's house, where their respective back gardens pretty much butted up against each other. A little later, when Ivan moved from Lidderdale Infant School to Dovedale Primary School at the age of 8, he and John became even closer, despite being a year behind John. However, John had a bad reputation among the parents of Woolton. Consequently, when it later came for Ivan to go to grammar school, Ivan's parents didn't want their son following John to Quarrybank School and become, as they said at the time, morally corrupted by that Lennon, as he was always disparagingly referred to by other parents. In fairness to those other parents, they didn't know the emotionally hard upbringing John had endured as a young boy that resulted in him lashing out at the deeply buried injustice of the world that he understandably felt at that time. After Ivan's death in 1993, his wife told a story about how and why Ivan and John bonded so quickly and so easily. She said, "One day, when Ivan was a young boy in Liverpool, there was a knock at the door. It was John Lennon, asking if he could come round to play. His garden was directly behind Ivan's, and they were close friends from then on. Ivan once spent a day at John's school, pretending to be a new boy. They shared a crazy sense of humour. Ivan's parents, along with other local parents, thought John was a terrible influence on their son, and consequently Ivan's parents made a fateful decision when it was time to leave junior school and attend secondary school. Owing to this decision, fate intervened once more because, by being sent away from John to a different secondary school, Ivan met and became best friends with Paul McCartney at his new school. So now Ivan had two close friends that had, at that point in time, not met. John was one of Ivan's closest friends at home, and Paul was one of Ivan's closest friends at secondary school. Before getting too far ahead with events, it's worth here talking about John's birth, early childhood, and subsequent reason why he ended up living with his Aunt Mimi. John Lennon was born on the 9th of October 1940 at Liverpool Maternity Hospital to Julia and Alfred Lennon. Alf was a merchant seaman who was away at the time of John's birth. Though Alf was often away from home, he initially sent regular paychecks to 9 Newcastle Road, Liverpool, where Lennon lived with his mother Julia when first born. However, Alf's check stopped when he went absent without leave in February 1944. Nobody knew where he had gone for half a year. When Alf eventually returned 6 months later, he offered to look after the family, but Julia was by then pregnant with another man's child and rejected Alf. After her childless sister Mimi twice complained to Liverpool social services about her lifestyle, Julia reluctantly gave her custody of John. Clearly it had a psychological effect on the very young John and confused him from such an early age. But more emotional damage was to come. As mentioned earlier, in July 1946, Alf visited Julia at Blomfield Road and took John to Blackpool, secretly intending to emigrate to New Zealand with him. Suspicious of Alf, Julia followed them, and after a heated argument, Alf forced 5-year-old John to choose between them. In one account of this incident, John twice chose his father. But as his mother walked away, the 5-year-old John began to cry and followed her. At that point, Alf and Julia agreed that Julia should take him and give him a home. John had no further contact with his father for 20 years, and very little after that, if at all any. Initially, John returned to the house Julia subsequently lived in on Blomfield Road, but as mentioned earlier, her sister Mimi reported Julia to social services because Mimi didn't believe Julia's lifestyle made her a suitable mother. So, throughout the rest of his childhood and adolescence, John lived at 251 Menlove Avenue. Julia didn't give up on John though. She visited regularly until her tragic death when knocked over and killed by an off-duty learner-driver policeman who didn't have a passenger sitting in the car with him as required by law. The off-duty policeman denied he had been drinking. I don't think they had breathalyzers at that time. In the years between moving into Mimi's house when 5 or 6 years old and Julia's death when he was 17, John increasingly went to 1 Blomfield Road, where Julia played John Elvis Presley records, taught him the banjo, and introduced him to the emerging rock and roll music that was becoming popular in the 1950s. Incidentally, Julia's house at 1 Blomfield Road on Allerton's Springwood estate was very recently sold at auction for nearly £280,000 to a huge Beatles fan bought for her by her parents. Coincidentally, the Blomfield Road semi-detached house had previously been owned by another Beatles fan, and that particular Beatles fan, well, she owned George Harrison's childhood home too. The more we discover about the history of 1 Blomfield Road, the more we realise it is an important address in the Beatles story, because it's where John, Paul, George, Ivan and Pete Shotton, another Vale Road resident, rehearsed prior to various skiffle group line-up changes and becoming the Beatles a few years later. Julia encouraged her son John to rehearse at her Blomfield Road corner house and enthusiastically enjoyed listening to them. So, despite Mimi's house on Menlove Avenue being the most famous childhood Lennon home, both Blomfield Road and Vale Road had a huge impact. Obviously, Vale Road can be seen to have played its part too, even though John didn't live there, but Vale Road can be seen to have played its part, if you believe in fate, in the Beatles story. A further example of this is it was Vale Road resident Quarryman member Pete Shotton that actually asked Paul McCartney to join their skiffle group after it had been discussed with, agreed and decided by John. Not long after the first meeting between John and Paul at the St Peter's Church Fete on Saturday 6th of July 1958, about half a mile up the hill from here, where Paul impressed John with his musical ability, Paul had cycled the couple of miles over from his teenage years' house on Forth Lynn Road to visit his mate Ivan. On this occasion, though, Ivan wasn't at home. This was way before mates could easily contact each other by mobile phone. As Paul killed time aimlessly cycling around the area, waiting for Ivan to return home, he bumped into Quarrymen member Pete Shotton on the corner of Linkster Road, where he was asked by Shotton if he'd like to join their skiffle group, led by John. Now, before it gets too long, I'll finish up here for this Musical Steps episode, but I will pick up the fascinating and fateful story again in the connected episodes from this series. So I hope to talk to you in those episodes too. If you'd like to be automatically notified when those further episodes are published, please like, subscribe, comment and ring the bell. So, see you later folks, and I hope to catch up with you in the connected episodes focused on John and Paul and the importance of Ivan Vaughan and indeed Lennon's mother Julia. See you later.